Change your life with the 12 healthiest foods you should eat every morning. By the time most people open their eyes, the liver has already spent the night working. Across roughly 8 hours of sleep, hepatic glycogen falls from something near 90 grams down toward 20, drawn off mostly by the brain, which consumes glucose at about 1/10 of a gram every minute, regardless of whether a person happens to be conscious. That drawdown is the ordinary arithmetic of an overnight fast. The body sitting up in bed is running on a reserve that has been substantially spent, and it has already started the work of replacing it. Cortisol is part of that replacement. Within the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, cortisol concentrations climb by somewhere between 38 and 75%, above the value measured at the moment of waking, with the peak landing around 30 to 40 minutes in. Researchers call this the cortisol awakening response, and it sits on top of the ordinary daily curve of the hormone rather than being the same thing. Two mechanisms produce it: adrenocorticotropic hormone, released from the pituitary as part of the normal activity of the hypothalamic pituitary-adrenal axis, with the sympathetic nervous system involved, and separately, exposure to daylight, which activates the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus and can by itself raise cortisol 50 to 60% above the waking value. The proposed function of that burst is unglamorous. It supplies energy for the transition out of sleep and prepares the system for whatever demands the day is expected to make. Cortisol does this in part by instructing the liver to produce glucose, which is also why blood sugar in the hours before waking tends to rise rather than fall. Clinicians call that the dawn phenomenon, and it is mainly a matter of circadian variation in hepatic glucose output, which begins increasing in the evening and reaches its maximum toward the end of the overnight fast. Cortisol, growth hormone, glucagon, and epinephrine all arrive around 4 in the morning with roughly the same message, and the liver responds by breaking down what glycogen remains and manufacturing more glucose out of protein and fat fragments. In a person with normal insulin function, none of this shows up as a problem. Enough insulin is secreted, and the tissues are sensitive enough to it that the morning rise gets absorbed without incident. That sensitivity itself follows a daily rhythm, and it peaks in the morning before declining through the evening. Work from the PREDICT studies, which fed standardized meals to large numbers of people while continuous glucose monitors recorded what happened, found that the same meal eaten at lunch produced on average a 2-fold higher glycemic response than when it was eaten at breakfast, with wide variation between individuals. So the first meal of the day arrives into a specific set of conditions: cortisol climbing, hepatic glucose production near its daily high, insulin sensitivity also near its daily high, and a fasted gut. 12 foods come up repeatedly in the research on what to put into that window, and they have very little in common with what most of the industrialized world actually eats before 9 in the morning. The typical Western breakfast is built around refined grain and sugar. Corn Flakes carry a glycemic index of 79 and Lucky Charms 77, which places both above table sugar on the same scale. A serving of many popular children's cereals contains 12 grams or more of added sugar, against a recommendation from the Environmental Working Group of no more than 4 grams and a federal child nutrition standard of no more than 6 grams per dry ounce. A child's entire daily allowance for added sugar is about 25 grams. One bowl can spend half of it before the school bus arrives. Juice does something similar with a healthier reputation. A whole orange has a glycemic load of about 6.2 per serving. The juice pressed from it has 13.4. The fruit carries roughly 3.1 grams of fiber per serving, and the juice carries about 0.5. In feeding trials, apple slices reduce total energy intake at the following lunch by 91 calories compared with applesauce, and by 150 calories compared with apple juice. The sugar is chemically identical in all three. What changes is the structure it arrives inside and how fast the small intestine can get at it. The consequences of that speed were mapped in unusual detail in a study published in Nature Metabolism in 2021 by Wyatt and colleagues, working across a British exploratory cohort and an American validation cohort. 1,070 participants ate 8,624 standardized meals and a further 71,715 meals of their own choosing, all under continuous glucose monitoring. The researchers were not primarily interested in the peak. They were interested in what happened afterward, at the 2 to 3 hour mark, when glucose in many people dropped below the level it had started at. That dip predicted behavior. Larger average dips at 2 to 3 hours correlated with greater hunger at the same point, a shorter interval before the next meal, and about 75 additional calories consumed at 3 to 4 hours. The effect carried through the full day. The correlation with total energy intake over 24 hours was stronger than the correlation with the meal immediately following. 75 calories is not a dramatic number. Multiplied by 365 mornings, it stops being trivial. Against that, the foods with real evidence behind them tend to share two properties. They are dense in protein or in viscous fiber, and they are structurally intact enough that digestion takes time. Eggs are the most studied of them. One hard-boiled egg contains 147 milligrams of choline, about 27% of the daily requirement, which makes eggs one of the most concentrated sources of that nutrient in the American food supply. The same egg carries roughly 265 micrograms of lutein and zeaxanthin, the carotenoids that accumulate in the retina, with 2 eggs supplying around 530 micrograms. Almost all of this sits in the yolk, and the fat surrounding it appears to be why absorption of those carotenoids from eggs is as good as it is. The weight trial most often cited on eggs was published in the International Journal of Obesity in 2008. 152 adults between 25 and 60 years old, with body mass index values between 25 and 50, were assigned to eat either a 2-egg breakfast of 340 calories or a bagel breakfast matched for calories and for energy density at least 5 days a week for 8 weeks. Half of each group was also placed on a calorie-restricted diet. Among those on the diet, the egg group showed a 61% greater reduction in body mass index, 65% greater weight loss, and an 83% greater decrease in waist circumference than the bagel group. The authors attributed the difference largely to adherence, on the grounds that people who feel full stay on a diet longer. A separate crossover study in adult men found that an egg breakfast lowered plasma ghrelin, the hormone that signals hunger to the hypothalamus, compared with a bagel breakfast, and reduced total energy intake across the following 24 hours. Ghrelin is the only known circulating hunger-stimulating hormone, so a breakfast that measurably suppresses it is doing something the eater can feel without knowing why. Protein does most of this work, and the dose appears to matter more than the source. The satiety literature converges on a within-meal threshold of about 30 grams, with effects visible from 20 grams upward and most consistent at 30 and above. In one comparison, a high-protein breakfast raised satiety ratings by 16% and fullness by 19% relative to a normal protein breakfast and lowered ghrelin. In another, energy intake at the subsequent lunch dropped significantly after a 39-gram protein meal compared with both a low-protein breakfast and no breakfast at all. Glucagon-like peptide 1, released from the gut in response to protein, is one of the signals carrying that message. Greek yogurt reaches the threshold more easily than most breakfast foods because the straining process removes whey and concentrates what remains. A 170-gram container generally holds 15 to 20 grams of protein, with low-fat versions landing near 17. Straining also removes some of the bacterial population, though live cultures remain in the billions per serving in products that carry the live and active cultures seal, typically Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus, sometimes with acidophilus, bifidus, or casei added back after fermentation. The label is worth reading because heat treatment after culturing kills the organisms, and the product can still be sold as yogurt. Cottage cheese is the same nutritional idea with different kinetics. Half a cup carries about 11 grams of protein and a full cup around 27, which is roughly half the daily requirement for an average adult in one bowl. About 80% of that protein is casein, which clots in stomach acid and releases amino acids over a stretch of 5 to 7 hours rather than in a single wave. The carbohydrate content is minimal, 3 to 4 grams per 100 grams. The sodium is not. Most cottage cheese runs 600 to 900 milligrams per cup, which is a meaningful fraction of a day's allowance in a food generally filed under health. There is a reason the morning is where the protein gap tends to show up. Surveys of adult intake find breakfast averaging around 13 grams of protein against roughly 38 grams at dinner, a threefold skew toward the end of the day. When intake is redistributed evenly across 3 meals instead, 24-hour muscle protein synthesis measures about 25% higher. A breakfast containing about 30 grams of protein produced roughly 30% higher muscle protein synthesis than a 10-gram breakfast on the first day of measurement. The window where insulin sensitivity is highest is also, for most people, the window where protein intake is lowest. Oats work through a different mechanism entirely. The active component is beta-glucan, a soluble fiber that dissolves in warm liquid and thickens, which is what produces the texture people either like or dislike about porridge. In the small intestine, that gel raises the viscosity of the gut contents, slows gastric emptying, and interferes with the reabsorption of bile acids, forcing the liver to pull cholesterol out of circulation to make more of them. The European Food Safety Authority reviewed this evidence and, in 2011 and 2012, authorized a claim for 3 grams of beta-glucan daily from oats or barley. The permitted wording is deliberately dry. Oat beta-glucan has been shown to lower blood cholesterol, and lowering blood cholesterol may reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. Meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials at that dose have found reductions in total cholesterol between 0.25 and 0.66 millimoles per liter, and in low-density lipoprotein cholesterol between 0.24 and 0.6. A systematic review of 17 randomized trials published in 2023 reached the same conclusion. A 40-gram serving of dry rolled oats, which is about half a cup, provides around 4 grams of total fiber and roughly 2 grams of beta-glucan, sometimes as little as 1. The 3-gram figure that the health claim rests on is therefore more than a standard bowl of porridge. Molecular weight and viscosity matter, as well as quantity, which is why heavy processing that fragments the beta-glucan chains can reduce the effect without changing what the label reports. The form of the grain does the work, not the name on the box. That principle extends to bread. Whole grain rye breads and rye endosperm products produce significantly lower insulin responses than white wheat bread, and breads made from 100% rye by the sourdough method, lower still. Imaging of gastric digestion showed why sourdough rye breaks apart far less in the stomach than wheat bread does, with starch granules remaining aggregated and less degraded. Sourdough is not a magic word, though. In overweight and obese men, when responses were adjusted for the mass of bread eaten rather than its carbohydrate content, sourdough produced a greater glucose and insulin area under the curve than 11-grain, sprouted grain, and 12-grain breads. Berries are the cheapest way to move fiber and polyphenols into a morning meal at the same time. A cup of raspberries carries about 8 grams of fiber. A cup of blueberries carries 3 to 4. Blueberries repay that difference in anthocyanins, the pigments responsible for the color, at around 558 milligrams per 100 grams of raw fruit. The trial most often cited on those pigments enrolled 61 healthy older adults between 65 and 80 years old in a double-blind randomized design. Participants took either 26 grams of freeze-dried wild blueberry powder containing 302 milligrams of anthocyanins or a matched placebo daily for 12 weeks. Endothelial function, arterial stiffness, blood pressure, cerebral blood flow, cognitive performance, the gut microbiome, and blood parameters were measured before and after. The blueberry group showed improvements in executive function, short-term memory, and reaction time, alongside vascular changes that the authors proposed as the mechanism. 26 grams of freeze-dried powder corresponds to roughly 178 grams of fresh berries, which is about a cup and a half. Chia seeds are unusual in how much fiber they carry for their size. 1 ounce, 28 grams, contains 138 calories, 4.7 grams of protein, 11.9 grams of carbohydrate, of which 9.8 grams is fiber, and 8.7 grams of fat. 5 of those fat grams are alpha-linolenic acid, the plant form omega-3, which accounts for about 60% of the seed's oil. Only 7 to 15% of the fiber is soluble, but that fraction is what forms the gel when the seeds sit in liquid, and the gel is what slows digestion enough to extend fullness past the 2-hour mark, where the glucose dip would otherwise arrive. Flaxseed is the seed with the strongest blood pressure evidence, and the form is not optional. Trials using whole or ground seed produced more pronounced reductions in systolic pressure and significant reductions in diastolic pressure than trials using flaxseed oil or isolated lignan. Doses range from 30 to 50 grams of seed per day. In one 6-month trial, systolic pressure in the flaxseed group ended approximately 10 millimeters of mercury lower and diastolic approximately 7 millimeters lower than control. Among participants who began with systolic pressure above 140, the reduction reached 15 millimeters systolic. Blood measurements at 1 month showed the omega-3 fatty acids had doubled and the lignans had increased tenfold, and both stayed elevated for the rest of the study. Whole flax seeds pass through the digestive tract largely intact, which is why the grinder matters. Almonds bring a different set of numbers. An ounce, about 23 kernels, supplies 6 grams of protein, 3.6 grams of fiber, nearly 9 grams of monounsaturated fat, 7.3 milligrams of vitamin E, and 76 milligrams of magnesium. The vitamin E figure is close to half a day's requirement from a small handful. The calorie figure on the package, meanwhile, is wrong in a direction that favors the eater. Standard Atwater factors overestimate the energy the body actually extracts from almonds by about 32%. Measurement of what is genuinely absorbed puts a 1-ounce serving near 129 calories, rather than the 168 to 170 printed on the label. Almond cell walls are rigid enough that a portion of the fat never gets released during digestion and leaves the body untouched. Walnuts have been tested over a longer horizon than almost any other food on this list. The Walnuts and Healthy Aging Study, run by Emilio Ros at the Hospital Clinic of Barcelona in partnership with Loma Linda University, randomized more than 600 healthy adults in their 60s and 70s to add 30 to 60 grams of walnuts daily to their usual diet, or to continue that diet unchanged, for 2 years. The findings on inflammatory biomarkers, published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, showed reductions in the walnut group. Walnuts carry about 2.5 grams of alpha-linolenic acid per ounce, along with polyphenols and melatonin, and the investigators proposed that combination rather than any single compound as the operative factor. Avocado supplies fat and fiber in the same package. About 100 grams, roughly half a medium fruit, contains around 15 grams of fat, predominantly monounsaturated and mostly oleic acid, 6.7 grams of fiber, and 485 milligrams of potassium. A randomized clinical trial in overweight and obese adults tested this directly at breakfast, comparing a low-fat control meal against meals containing half an avocado, delivering 8.6 grams of fiber, or a whole avocado delivering 13.1 grams. Hunger suppression was greater after the whole avocado meal than after the control, and satisfaction was higher after both avocado meals. The mechanism proposed was delayed gastric emptying, combined with stimulation of the gut hormones that report fullness to the brain. Leafy greens are where the evidence gets less tidy, and it is worth saying plainly rather than smoothing over. Spinach, rocket, and lettuce are dense in inorganic nitrate, which oral bacteria reduce to nitrite, and the body then converts to nitric oxide, a signaling molecule that relaxes the smooth muscle in blood vessel walls. Short-term studies have found what that mechanism predicts: spinach consumption producing lower blood pressure and higher arterial compliance, and daily nitrate-rich vegetables raising plasma nitrate and nitrite while lowering systolic and diastolic pressure to the same degree as beetroot juice supplementation. Then a 5-week trial in people with elevated blood pressure gave one group leafy green vegetables and another group pills containing the same quantity of inorganic nitrate, and found no decrease in ambulatory systolic pressure in either. Population studies continue to link higher leafy green intake with lower blood pressure. The controlled trials do not agree with each other about whether the nitrate is why. Green tea rounds out the 12, and its case rests mostly on a 2-compound interaction rather than on antioxidants. Tea contains L-theanine, an amino acid found almost nowhere else in the food supply, which modulates alpha-band electrical activity in the brain associated with the deployment of attention and the suppression of distraction. Combined with caffeine, it improves accuracy on attention-switching tasks and subjective alertness. 100 milligrams of theanine with 50 milligrams of caffeine improved attention parameters more than caffeine alone in healthy adults. A meta-analysis found moderate effect sizes for the combination in the first 2 hours after a dose, on alertness ratings and attention-switching accuracy specifically. The evidence for epigallocatechin gallate, the catechin that appears in most marketing copy about green tea, is thinner. The same review concluded that no firm statement could be made about effects induced by that compound, because too few intervention studies had been done. Underneath all 12 foods sits a shortfall that is easier to state than to fix. The average American consumes about 15 grams of fiber a day. The recommendation is 25 grams for women and 38 for men. 5% of men and 9% of women meet it. That gap is one of the most consistent nutritional features of the Western diet, and among the most consequential, given the links between low fiber intake and both cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. One meal also does not stay in one meal. David Jenkins, the researcher at the University of Toronto who developed the glycemic index, described what he called the second meal effect in 1982. The composition of one meal alters the glucose response to the next one. Glycemic responses at breakfast were significantly lower on mornings following low glycemic index dinners than after high glycemic index dinners, and varying the fiber content of the dinner without changing its glycemic index made no difference. The effect runs forward as well. A high-protein breakfast produced greater insulin and glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide responses at the subsequent lunch in people with type 2 diabetes, and skipping breakfast entirely has been associated with higher postprandial glucose after lunch in healthy young adults. What none of this does is happen quickly, and the timescales in the research are worth holding on to. The blueberry trial ran 12 weeks before it measured anything. The flaxseed blood pressure numbers came at 6 months, even though the biomarkers confirming that people were actually eating the seed had already moved at 1 month. The walnut trial ran 2 years. The oat cholesterol trials that produced the figures behind the European health claim generally ran a minimum of 4 weeks with daily dosing. Nothing eaten on a Tuesday morning shows up in a lipid panel by Friday, and the studies were not designed to suggest otherwise. The longer horizon evidence comes from cohorts rather than trials, and it points the same direction with less precision. In the Framingham Offspring study, each additional daily serving of ultra-processed food was associated with a 7% increase in incident cardiovascular disease across 18 years of follow-up. The French Nutrinet Santé cohort found a 12% increase in cardiovascular risk at higher intakes. The Tehran lipid and glucose study found 68% greater cardiovascular incidence in the highest intake group compared with the lowest. Pastries and cookies fall squarely inside the ultra-processed category as it is defined, characterized by high energy density, refined starch, free sugars, salt, and low levels of protein, fiber, and micronutrients. That category is also coarse enough to break in places, which a 2024 analysis of 3 large American cohorts demonstrated. Sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meats carried strong associations with increased cardiovascular risk, consistent with everything else in the literature. Ultra-processed breads, cold cereals, yogurt, and dairy desserts, examined separately, showed either no association or slightly reduced risk. A classification system that puts a sweetened breakfast cereal and a supermarket wholemeal loaf in the same bin is measuring something real, but it is not measuring only one thing. And the honest version of this is that the processing category and the nutrient content of a specific product are correlated rather than identical. Individual variation complicates it further. The PREDICT researchers used machine learning to predict a person's glucose and triglyceride responses to a given meal, and found they needed the meal composition, the person's habitual diet, the context of the meal, their body measurements, their genetics, their gut microbiome, and their clinical blood work to do it with any accuracy. Meal timing, exercise, and sleep influenced postprandial responses about as much as the macronutrient composition of the food itself. 2 people eating the identical bowl of oats at the identical hour can produce measurably different curves, and neither of them is doing anything wrong. What the trial breakfasts actually looked like, across this whole body of work, was fairly plain. 2 eggs, a container of strained yogurt with berries and ground seeds stirred through it, porridge made from rolled rather than instant oats, with nuts on top, half an avocado on rye, tea instead of the second coffee. The interventions that produced the numbers were rarely exotic, and the control arms they beat were usually a bagel, a bowl of flakes, or nothing at all. The liver, meanwhile, will keep doing what it does. It begins raising glucose output in the small hours, regardless of what is planned for breakfast, and it will have released most of what it's stored by the time the alarm goes. Whether the next thing to arrive extends that supply or spends it faster is a question the small intestine settles within about 90 minutes, and the continuous glucose monitors in those studies recorded the answer without anyone having to feel it happen.